basis. Okay, let me kick off this morning then. So first of all, P'nawn da, croeso. So good afternoon and welcome. This is our first Centre for Digital Public Services Knowledge Sharing Series event. For those of you I don't know, I'm Victoria Ford and I'm working with the Centre as Communications Lead, and I'm going to support today's session and hopefully keep everything running smoothly. I'm sure most of you are now pretty familiar with Zoom. We've all been using it for a while, but before I introduce our speakers today, I'll just take us through tips that will hopefully make sure it runs smoothly for everybody. And I'll also explain a little bit about the format for the session. We've got an hour booked out, so in a moment I'll hand you over to our speakers and then we'll open the floor for our questions and discussions. We're absolutely happy to use the full hour, but if we finish earlier, that's fine as well. We want it to be interactive, so we are going to allow plenty of time for discussion, but there's quite a few of us on here, which is absolutely brilliant. So if you could just check you're on mute, especially while the speakers are talking, because the background noise can be distracting for people. And then when we move on to questions, or if people want to just make any statements or raise any issues, then if you can put your hand up virtually using the button. I think you might have to press the participants button to be able to raise your hand, but if you could do that, it means that we can call people in and hopefully not have too many overlaps. Hopefully it'll, from a technical perspective, everything will be okay, but if you've got any technical issues or general queries, please feel free to use the chat function. And like I've said, please use it to chat amongst yourselves. We'd love to be running some face-to-face networking events alongside some online ones, but we can't do that right now. So let's just use the tech we've got and try and build our networks. So that's it for the logistics. So I'll introduce our speakers. I don't know whether they can put a little icon on themselves, I say their name, but you'll see them in a minute when they speak anyway. We're joined today by Tim Daly, who is Programme Lead from the Centre, Jess Neely, who's Service Design and Research Lead at Praga, Wales, Ian Vaughan from Neath Port Talbot Council, and Darius Pocha from Create Change. And Darius is also a member of our advisory panel at the Centre. So before we go into the slides, I'll just hand you over to Tim to say a few words, please, if you would.
Thanks, Victoria. Hi, everyone. So just to give you a bit of background on the Centre and a bit of context. So we've been in place for about 6 months now, maybe a little bit longer in earnest. We did some discovery work, just worked out that there was a real need and desire for better digital services right across the Welsh public sector. So we have been in our sort of alpha phase for about 5 or 6 months now. Testing, probing, what works best, what doesn't work, all that kind of stuff. We've got 3 main work streams. One is to support better delivery, one is to support building skills and capability, and one is to start to create communities and of practice around things like digital skills, and in particular around set of standards that we've implemented, stand on the shoulders of work done by people like GDS. We've taken the service standards and created a set that we think work for Wales based on feedback and some work we've done over the last few months. A key element of that is putting the user at the heart of everything we try and do, and taking a service design approach. So this session is really about sharing some of that knowledge with everyone, and hopefully people participate in our communities of interest around these subjects. And hopefully some of the people who are on here will meet people they've never met before, see people talk who they've never seen talk before, and ask lots of questions, and hopefully follow it on later on with follow-ups to people who they've got shared mutual interests with. This is the first in a bunch of these sort of sessions that Victoria has mentioned earlier. So we'll be guided by what people want to hear about, but at the moment we think this is a great place to start. And I think we'll get going with our 3 excellent speakers who will share the sort of things that we're trying to achieve.
Thank you, Tim. I'm going to share my screen now to take us through the slides. We had hoped to pass control of them back and forth between the speakers, but technically that's not quite worked. So we may have to do that terrible thing where the speakers have to say next slide, please. So apologies for that in advance, but we want to make it as smooth as possible. So bear with me while I just share my screen with you. This is where it doesn't come up. Let's try that. 1 second. Might have to fill the gap now, Tim, while I try and get this to work.
Tell us a joke, Tim.
Okay, I think we're nearly there.
Oh, I was just about to then.
Right, we don't need that. We don't need that. We should. God, that's not the right one either. Sorry. It was all there waiting for us before, and now it's not. But, you didn't need to see all of my slides. Okay, we get there. We'll get there. Right. Let me just let these people in. Multitasking, so it's never been a strong point of mine. Okay, I'm hoping everyone can see the screen now. Someone give me a nod. Jess, I can see you on the screen. Give me a nod if you can see that. Perfect. Thank you. Sorry about that. We get there. Right, I shall hand you over now to Darius, who's going to take us through the first part of our presentation this morning. Darius, over to you. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Victoria. Can everybody hear me all right? Nod? Yeah, good. All right. Next slide, please. So if you look at at how nations all over the world are transforming their public services, you could be forgiven for thinking that only one word matters, and that word is digital. Digital's the medium, and it has lots of inherent advantages, but no amount of technology is going to make a service good unless it's designed around the needs of the people who have to use it. Next slide, please. So this is the starting point for Centre for Digital Public Services, to design services around the needs of the people who use them, and crucially in collaboration with them, to give them what they say they need, not what we think they need. Next slide, please. My company Create Change works on public services in education, social care, health and justice. And last year I spent a bit of time helping set up the transformation of cancer screening in England. So it's an extreme example, but if there's any service or any group of services that teaches you about how important it is to concentrate on user needs rather than process, this is it. So, you know, here are just some of the users who are involved in that. There are the women who are going for screening appointments, receptionists who book them in, the nurses that actually do the smear test. There's lab technicians who process that. If it moves into a secondary care setting, there are doctors who get involved. Here are just some of the places they use those services. So you might interact with that at home because you might receive a letter or a phone call. You might be in a GP surgery, you might be in a sexual health clinic. Your results go to a lab, you might end up in a hospital. And here are just some of the touch points across that service. You might get a letter, you might get a phone call. Your sample will have a test tube label that has to be processed in a lab. So all of these things come together to make the service. I'm really excited to hear Ian talking later about he and his team been approaching adult social care services, because, you know, that's this bit where the service actually meets users and has to interact with them in the real world. That's what we mean by service design. Next slide, please. I want to give you a couple of inspirational examples from other countries that show what's possible. In the last 5 years, Estonia has become a world leader in public services, despite having no inherent technology advantages. They just decided to do it. And one of the things they've achieved is this thing called the single patient record. So the single patient record is like the holy grail of most healthcare systems. England and Wales is nowhere near it. And what they've managed to do is they've managed to integrate data from across all of Estonia's healthcare providers. So what does that mean actually for users? Well, it means that they get better services at the point of use, and those services are designed around how they want to use them and how they want to interact with them. It means that in the event of an accident or emergency, clinical staff get access to time-critical information about the patient. It means that from the government's point of view, there's increased efficiency, there's less bureaucracy, there's less admin. And because patient records aren't federated across a whole bunch of different systems, it means there's a potential to make the whole thing a lot more secure. Next slide, please. The Taiwanese government has produced a really remarkable response to the pandemic. Like Estonia, there's no inherent reason that Taiwan should be better at this than anybody else, other than the fact that they had the SARS epidemic in 2004. So it's made them think about how to do public services and how to implement public health. So the remarkable thing is, this is a country with much greater population density than the UK or the US, but nobody has died there since April. So here are just some of the things that they've done. Very early on in January, they made real-time information on which pharmacies had current stock of PPE and masks and other protective equipment, where citizens could go and buy them quickly. When they had to implement mask rationing, they were able to do that on the basis of individual health data that had been collected using their ID cards. They've produced a really innovative set of responses, public health campaigns around myth busting to make sure that citizens have the right behaviours and know what's going on, and that misinformation, fake news is effectively, the way they describe it is vaccinating the population against misinformation. And here's the thing, in a nation of 24 million citizens, they've had no reported cases since June. So there's a sort of meme that people in Asian countries are more obedient, but bear in mind that in Taiwan, this is a country where 6 years ago, hundreds of protesters stormed the national government buildings and held off riot police for 2 weeks. So it's not a nation of people who do as they're told, but it is one where citizens largely trust their government. And that's very largely down to the fact that over the last 5 years, the government has been able to demonstrate a lot of transparency with citizens, especially around their data, and they've co-designed services with the people that use them. So that in itself is a really inspiring thing. I think just the fact that public services in an age of polarization and misinformation, if they're designed really well and citizens feel like government is taking notice of them, can produce these sorts of effects. Next slide, please. So what will it take to make Wales a global leader in digital public services? And why not as well? Next slide. So above all else, I think it's going to take leadership, and the centre can provide some of that in terms of strategy and tools and education and pilot projects, but it's also going to take leadership from guys like you in your departments and organisations. So that's me. I'm really excited to hear from Jess and Ian, and also to sort of talk to you guys. Next slide, please. And if you've got any questions for me and you don't get a chance to ask them now, then please just reach out to me on Twitter. Thanks very much. That's me.
Thank you, Darius. I'll hand you straight over to Jess.
Cool, thank you. You can hear me okay? I'm unmuted. So hi everyone, I'm Jess. I am the Service Design and Research Lead at Parago Wales. We are a digital change consultancy based in South Wales, and we focus on making public sector services better. So over the next 5 minutes, I'm going to talk a bit about where I think we are with user-centred service design in Wales, and then a bit about how we can keep this conversation going. So where do I think we are with it? I'm going to assume by now that you are already a believer in this way of working. I can see lots of familiar faces in the crowd of people that I know totally believe in this. But if you're not yet, then you can maybe fire some challenging questions at me later. But I think there is a really great opportunity in Wales to design our public services in a user-centred way. Lots of services are designed here through Welsh Government, the arm's length bodies, local government, NHS Wales, housing associations, charities. We have lots of services to design, so that gets a tick. We also have lots of skilled and experienced service design people here. So these are people who are keen to apply their skills onto these services, and you might be one of those people here today, so hello. And on top of that, we have plenty of people who are interested in this way of working, but don't necessarily have much hands-on experience yet. Either they already work in the public sector, but they're used to working in a different way. If you're that person, then hello. Or because they're not currently working in the public sector or in user-centered design, but are looking to like break into it. So also hello to anyone who falls into that category here. So we have lots of services, lots of people keen to design them. So it's all sounding good so far. But where I think we struggle is we don't have enough openings yet for experienced user-centered practitioners to work on our many services. I keep my eyes peeled for what jobs are being recruited in service design locally, and I do find it like quite appallingly few. The vast majority of our user-centered jobs in Wales are working in central government bodies, and this is because central government teams were essentially forced to create these roles. Now, it's not a problem that we have user-centered design people working on UK government services based in Wales, because of course those services need to be well designed too. It needs to be easy to apply for your driving license or to like register your business. But I think it's a shame that we're letting our top service design talent in Wales be swallowed up by central government, instead of putting people to work on Welsh services that will make such a difference to the people that live here. Things like health, things like housing, like our devolved services. And if our great user-centered practitioners don't work in central government, then they'll typically commute to Bristol, work remotely for companies in England, move away, or just work away during the week. And I do think that is a shame for Wales, that we're leaking some of our talent like that. And also it can be difficult to break into this industry in the first place. And I have like so much to say about that topic, but I won't go into detail about that now because I haven't got a huge amount of time. But to summarize, I think that we have the services here, we have the supply of people who want to work on the services, but it feels like we could be doing more to like unlock the demand for this type of work. So next slide, please, Victoria. So the next thing I want to talk about is communities. So how can we help each other, support each other to design better public services? And one of the best parts of my job has been being part of these communities of people who are all on this journey together, all kind of learning together and sharing what we know. I've put on the screen some of the communities that I've been directly involved with. Some of these are actually UK-wide and some are more local. Although admittedly, as I'm based in Cardiff, my involvement has been centred around meeting up with people in South East Wales, and other things might also exist in other parts of Wales too. But in my experience, it's been that the Wales-based communities are typically a bit broader. So not just people who are interested in user-centered service design, but people who care about transforming the public sector ways of working more broadly, which is great. But to kind of address that niche, myself and a few others started arranging service design specific meetups in Cardiff to connect people who do this kind of work day to day. And originally we thought it might just be a few of us meeting in the pub for a chat. But what we actually found is like a lot of people were interested in coming, which is obviously amazing. But it turned into a bit more of like an events management side hustle to organise it. And that's not necessarily like the most sustainable model for such an important community like this, to rely on like volunteers' time, scrapping together the time and money to run it. So maybe there's a role for the Centre for Digital Public Services to play in facilitating this. Next slide, please, Victoria. So this is just my last slide, just briefly to end. In central UK government, you have the well-established Gov Design community, and this was run by a centrally funded team, although very recently that has changed. I'm not exactly sure what's happening with it now, but my experiences of being part of this community when I was working in central government was like really excellent. I went to meetups, either in person or virtually. I spoke to people online through Slack or through like the mailing list. I had amazing training that I could attend through it. And as well as the obvious professional development benefits of being involved in something like this, like being part of these communities is just really good for the soul, like being connected to people who are like-minded and facing the same struggles as you. Like it's really weirdly energizing and can motivate you to keep going, because doing user-centered service design, like it can be hard, especially if it's new to your organisation, especially if it's new to you, especially if you don't have the leadership support in place where you are right now. So I think it's really important that we do keep talking to each other in Wales and we have the right support to do this. So I'll be really interested at the end to hear what you all think about this and what you think is needed here. But before that, I'm going to pass it over to Ian, who's going to talk to you a bit about a project they've been working on in Newport Talbot.
Thanks, Jess. I'm really excited to be here today because for me, it's service design that is the missing piece of digital transformation. Digital transformation isn't about blockchain or robotic processes or going paperless. It's how do we make our services that we provide our residents and businesses easier for them, and that's by designing them based on their user needs. And service design is really key to this. Next slide, please. It's also part of our digital strategy where we will co-design our services with our users to become customer-centric. So it was really pleasing to be chosen by the centre to be part of this pioneer project, because what we are trying to do is put the user at the heart of everything we do, and service design is key to it. But in principle, and the theory sounds right, but implementing it is difficult because, and this is where some of the challenges has been, and working with the centre has really helped us along this journey. So we were looking for a good exemplar to use, and it was chosen as adult social care because it's a complex piece of. There are multiple ways in for residents to contact social care. So this is a key thing that we wanted to approach. But from our own council point of view, what we wanted to do was how we approach digital transformation to create user-centred services, but how do we introduce service design and agile into the council to spread awareness, because it's not just an IT thing, it's an all organisational thing. And also how do we collaborate better with other councils, which is why it's so pleasing to be working with Blaenau Gwent and Vaughan on this, alongside the Centre and Social Finance, because the knowledge transfer is going to be key going forward. Next slide, please. So there's been lots of new buzzwords and terminology that we've had to learn quite quickly. And sometimes the language can be a barrier at first, especially when you're talking with multidisciplinary teams who perhaps wouldn't have been involved in this type of work before. So even on screen there, it's agile delivery. And it's a totally different way of doing it. Now, agile has come from like a software piece, and some organizations do agile, but not many do it from a service design perspective. And it's the discovery phase for me that is key in terms of success for this. And it's often overlooked, especially when there's pressures to come up with a predefined digital solution without fully understanding the needs and the requirements of our users. And it's having that multidisciplinary team with the right mix of skills to create the right solution. Next slide, please. So this is how we approached it really. So as I mentioned earlier, there's lots of new words, phrases, different ways of working. And what the Centre and Social Finance have been doing with us, Vaughan and Blaenau Gwent, is really allowing us to step back and understand what our users want from adult social care. As I said earlier, it's a complex service, but by approaching it through this discovery phase, it's allowed us to get a much better understanding of what our users want. And the key thing that's come out for me on this is user research is essential, and listening to users, and the core design as a multidisciplinary team. Now, on the slide there, there's different approaches of what we've done, from stakeholder interviews, service mapping, data gathering, user interviews with our own staff, our residents, And just by bringing all this together gives us such a much better and deeper insight that we would never had before. We would have approached it by perhaps putting an online form out or a new system. But this has really opened our eyes and given us a much deeper understanding of what people want. It was mentioned on the last slide about agile, and there's lots of phrases around agile, but for me, in terms of from a council or organizational perspective, the benefits of agile have been, it's a really great way to share with each other what we're learning, to collaborate, especially when there's different partners involved. It's been a great way to collaborate, but also work in the open. And that knowledge sharing has been key in terms of this journey so far. And I insist it is a journey and there is some way to go, but part of this piece of work so far has been really enlightening. And it's also the constant communication through these sprint plan sessions, retros, week notes, which comes back, as I mentioned earlier, there's lots of new phrases and ways of working, but the outcome of it is it's really helped us to learn quickly from each other. So by doing this work, the outcome has been centered around the front door and how do we make it easier for our residents to contact us easier and quicker and more efficient. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned earlier, the process of service design, and it is a phrase that there's lots of terminology around it, but in simple terms, it's how does it help us design the right thing for the customer? Because that is key going forward, and it comes back to user needs and the benefit of the discovery work and taking a user-centric and combine it with the data that we've got already. The benefits of using this approach is it helps us reduce the chance of building the wrong thing. So being user-centric, agile and iterative really works. And that iterative development of showing residents what we're building, getting their feedback early is key to service design, because it ensures that what we ship out to them is the right thing, what they're looking for. And it matters because a recent GDS survey a few years ago mentioned that 80% of the cost of government services is spent on service. But more alarmingly, 60% of the cost of these services is spent on service failure. And this is where service design comes into its own, because when we design services better, it reduces our failure demand because the end user gets the right result, what they set out to do when they get in contact with us as a council. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to show quickly of some of the outputs from some of this work. And again, some of this has been new to us as well in terms of creating personas. So from the work that we've been doing with residents, it's allowed us to get a better insight of our staff, which is important for our internal stakeholders, but what are the problems and the pain points and opportunities that our residents are finding with the service. And it's uncovered so much and helped us move into the alpha phase of where we're creating a prototype and testing these prototypes with the users. And that is a key part, as I mentioned, the iterative part of service design and the learning. It's a constant learning and feedback loop. The customer journey maps for me have been one of the most powerful outputs that's come out of this, because they've got a focus on users. It's really allowed us to spot opportunity areas and better analyze our service in detail. And sometimes it's these things that's overlooked, but when it's visually down as a journey map combined with the other data we've collected, the personas, the quantitative data, when all that comes together, and this comes back to my original point on the discovery phase, why it's so important, because the outputs from this shape the product going forward. So I can't emphasize enough just how important this phase is, because instead of designing from an organisational point of view, which is what we tended to do, some of our processes may be 30 plus years old, it's allowing us now to design services that not just meet user needs, but are designed for the internet. And this is what people want now. They want the same experience from the public service in Wales as they get in the private sector. So this has been really beneficial for us as a council. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to touch upon some user feedback. So this is from Chris, who's a service manager in social services. And it has been a journey because people see digital as an IT thing. So getting them on board early and really making them co-design with us, along with the centre, social finance, and Blaenau Gwent and Torfaen have been key. So the feedback that he shared with me this week really sums up the message and the shift that this project has brought into our organisation so far, where he mentions that residents' views in the design of our services have to be the heart of everything that we do, and focusing on the resident experience. So it's that shifting away from seeing digital as being an IT thing to an organisational wide approach to change. And that's been one of the key messages that's come out of this as well. Next slide, please. I mentioned it at the very start of my slides. And for me, this is the key takeaway. Without service design, there is no real transformation, because it's not about the technology. It's not about the new system that we can put on top of a existing process. It's really understanding our customer and redesigning our services for what they need, and also that meets their demands that the internet era has brought to us and has been accelerated in the last 9 months as well. And it's how we design our services as whole services, so not just in silos, but at end-to-end, front to back, and also multi-channel. And it's the multi-channel approach is key. And that's what's come out of some of this work that we've been doing, is it might not be a digital outcome. There'll be elements of it where, for example, SMS is going to be used to interact with our residents, because that, from the user research, that's the lowest common touch point that's come out of it. So just to end my slides, I'd just like to emphasize the service design is really worth doing. But as Jess touched upon earlier, there is a skills gap. And this is where the centre and collaborating with each other is really going to be key to ensure that the services that we build and design for the future for the public sector in Wales are the right things to be doing. Thanks, Victoria.
Thank you very much, Ian, and thank you, Jess and Darius as well. Just so that I'm going to stop sharing my screen now in a second and just go into some questions. While I'm doing that, Ian, one for you, if I may. I think it's really interesting, the collaboration between 3 councils in this. I wonder if you could say a little bit about the learning and the shared themes maybe that have come out of that across the 3 councils.
Yeah, I touched on it earlier, Victoria. It's a collaboration with other partners, because we're all doing the same thing in essence, but it's that collective knowledge has been so powerful of pulling ideas and thoughts and ways of working to approach a solution together. And what it's done is it's sped things up.
And I think that collaboration bit becomes so important, doesn't it? It's going to be key for all the work that not just we need to do from within the centre, but across all public sector services in Wales. We'd like to open this up to the virtual room now, so we'd love to hear your thoughts, questions, or any great examples of service design work. I think the best way to do it is if you'd like to contribute is to raise your hand if you can. If not, for any reason, drop it into the chat, or equally, I will try and keep those of you got your cameras on, I will try and keep a little look and see if anyone's waving at us to contribute in that. But any thoughts from anybody?
Can I ask a question? Yeah.
Yeah,
I was just wondering if there were any plans to do this kind of squad approach with any other organisations or other challenges again in the future.
Tim, can I ask you to pick that one up?
Yeah, so the answer is yes, there is ambition to do it. So it depends on two things. So one side of it is clearly funding, and therefore we're in discussions with Welsh Government about funding. Our initial goal was to get a number of squads out there to work with different people with different problems and see what, demonstrate the sort of positive stuff that Ian's just talked about. So we're waiting to hear on that. Obviously, it's all tied up with COVID recovery and response and things like that. So it depends on how much that is. And the second side of it is people have approached us. We got a couple of initiatives where we're supporting different people pull together their own squads to do this kind of stuff. So the centre has provided the funding to support the work that Ian's talking about. But actually, if people have got initiatives they want to do and they want to do them in a different way, so we've got things like digital democracy, which will be across all 22 local authorities, where we're going to support that kind of joint approach. There's additional learning needs within education. So there's different things where we're trying to put the approach in. It depends where the funding comes from is the honest answer, but we're trying to take the same approach to both things.
And for me, Tim, the squad approach has been key because it's filled in the gaps in terms of our knowledge that we didn't have in councils, in terms of the user researchers, the service design, in many ways, the business analysis, or how to run a project in an agile service design, user-centered way. So it's brought a lot of benefits, really, of bringing that expertise into an organisation, plus working with the other two councils. It's, from our perspective, it's accelerated our adoption of service design by greatly.
Thank you. I can see in the chat, Julian Blewett. Julian, I don't know whether you want to jump in and ask the question. And I see Valerie saying that she's interested as well. But the question in there, and I said, Julian, please feel free to chip in as well, is about how we create opportunities for new people coming into the service design space to develop their skills and experiences. And how do they co-learn alongside early adopters? Now, I think there's probably a bit of a question for the centre there, Tim, but actually I'd be interested as well from Jess and Darius's perspective on that one. We're all wondering who's going to go first, aren't they?
Jess, why don't you? Because you were talking about communities, weren't you?
Yeah, so yeah, there's multiple different ways, I think. Like there is just communities, because typically people that work in this area are like super passionate about it. So going to meetups, like learning from each other, like mentoring, there's all that sort of stuff that can just be kind of done like for free. But then there's the other side of it around like actually hiring in specialists to work with you on projects. That obviously involves kind of buy-in from people that hold budgets. I'm not sure if you are one of those people, Julian. If you are, then that's great. But if not, then that could be more difficult. But yeah, partnering with external companies or even hiring your own in-house specialists, like that is obviously much more sustainable than relying on like outsourcing it. But I think outsourcing it can also be like a helpful first step into it. What do you think, Darius? Would you add anything to that?
No, I 100% agree. I think in terms of sort of building capability, I'm a huge fan of public servants shadowing experienced practitioners, because I think with service design is a bit of a technical discipline. it's a bit like kind of in the design world, I think of service designers as a bit like architects. You know, they've kind of like, you need to see the big picture, you've got to understand all the materials very well, you need to be able to take the 30,000 foot view of stuff, but you also need to kind of zoom in on details. And those sorts of skills are not taught very well in abstract, in my experience. They're taught much better in the context of delivery. So I think, just like Jess was saying, you know, whether it's about you developing skills yourselves or whether it's about developing capability within your organization, having experience, being able to shadow experienced practitioners is a fast track to developing capability.
Yeah, just to add from the centre's perspective, I think Jane has put in the chat there. One of our work streams, we're just in the process of wrapping up a first piece of discovery on how to raise those skills and capabilities, and these kind of things are coming up, obviously, and absolutely agree with Jess and Darius there that some of this stuff is much better when done hands-on. So actually some of the connections we want to make through sessions like this, because sometimes it's difficult, you know, for us to put somebody in to work with Ian's team to watch and see how things are working. We've got the data sharing, we've got the agreements of how to share with people across different boundaries. It just becomes a will then as to how we can start to connect people. So I think there's a willingness to share across those boundaries and let people come and see what's going on. Even if it's just between, it doesn't have to be between one local authority to another or from one arm's length body to another. It can be across, because these are sort of functional skills rather than professional skills we're talking about. So we'll hopefully come up with some ideas on how to split that between, you know, more traditional learning methods and some of the real hands-on sharing.
Thank you. And one of the things we wanted to discuss a bit here really was about the communities of interest, communities of practice, the other way to describe it. How do we best bring people together who do have that interest? You know, Jess said people tend to be really passionate about this stuff. And how do we best bring people like yourselves who've signed up today for this to have a continued conversation about this as we start really pushing the way that we deliver services differently in Wales? So any thoughts on that are welcome as well. Somebody has said that the hands up function isn't working for them, which suggests to me it may not be working for anyone, sorry. So, you know, if you do want to speak, unmute yourself and sort of join in, or just put a little note saying you'd like to speak in the chat, and I'll sort of invite you in that way as well, because I can see some great comments coming in here and it'd be good to talk about some of these things. Janine, I can see you put in there about the digital strategy for Wales and skills. Do you want to pop in and just say a couple of lines about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I was just looking for the link to put it in the chat. That's why I'm slow getting myself on screen then. So Welsh Government's currently consulting on a new digital strategy for Wales. I'm sure the eagle eyes amongst you will probably have noticed that the one that is currently published is very elderly. But despite it being elderly, there's still an awful lot of things in there that ring true in terms of priority areas for government and the economy. So Lee Waters, as the lead minister for digital in Cabinet, didn't want to do a traditional sort of 12-week publish a PDF on the Welsh Government website and hope for the best type engagement to get views on that strategy. So what we've been doing is blogging about the individual missions, the pillars and the priority areas within that strategy. So Lee did his introductory blog last week. Feels longer, but it's only last week. The first mission that we blogged about was around digital public services, and we worked very closely with the centre on that. And for those of you who've already seen the blog, there's a short video from the centre and Sally talking about transformation. And we'll be publishing later this week the digital economy, and next week we will also be publishing another blog around data and collaboration. I'll put the link in the chat in a second after I've stopped talking. And then after Christmas, we'll be blogging about digital skills, digital connectivity, and also around digital inclusion. So please feel free to comment on what we've said in our blogs, on what you believe the priorities for Wales are, what you think we're doing right, what you think we're doing wrong. We really welcome views from as many people as we possibly can on this, with a view then to obviously taking all of that feedback that we've had and hopefully publishing something well, at the end of the winter, stroke beginning of the spring. We've got a Welsh Government cabinet slot penciled in for the end of February, so hopefully to publish something thereafter. But you know, Lee really genuinely does want an open and constructive conversation on this, as we do as officials. So please feel free to say what you think.
Thank you, Janine. And yes, you've dropped the link in, people can have a look at that. That's great. Thank you. Just looking through the chat comments, Ariel, you talked about some work that you're doing in the third sector. Are you happy to tell us a little bit more about that? That looks interesting. People might want to hear a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's just some massive links, and from my experience, because I work both across the third sector and public sector as well, and it seems to always be so separate, and I know that that's based on funding, but there's actually a lot of these movements happening like all across the charity sector as well, and it's how these things can be linked in. So for example, the Catalyst, I don't know if you've heard of them, they're like, you know, huge amounts of lottery money, and their whole role is to basically create communities of interest and provide funding for sort of designers to work with charitable organizations to create change. And one of the big things that they do at the moment is like a design hop. It's just one of their initiatives where I was actually delivering one this morning, and you get groups of organizations in to actually work on a challenge. So they work on a real challenge, it's tight, you know, very small one over a couple of weeks period. And we find that really effective. But I suppose my point is around how these links can happen, because there is a lot of that stuff going on. Another thing they do that I think is really interesting is these service recipes. And it's like organizations who've already done it. For example, like Bernardo's have currently worked out how to use WhatsApp in their services with young people. And they like publish then this service recipe so that, again, when you're designing, you're not like recreating the wheel, and you're able to asset map and have a look at like what else is there. So I just think there's lots of links to be made, you know, because I work across the both, and I find often they're not always working together.
Yeah, I think that's right. And part of this is absolutely how do we join up the stuff that's there, because the centre is absolutely not about reinventing wheels. If things are already existing, we want to tap into them. And part of the reason for doing these sessions is to try and capture some of this stuff and get people talking differently. So I don't know, is anyone else out there aware of any other things that are happening similar to that in other sectors that could be useful for us to join up? Silence. Probably I'm reading through the comments because people put a few things in there. Claire, you talked about the University of South Wales being interested in developing pathways to incorporating skills. I think that's another good area about looking at knowledge exchange in there. Is there anything you'd like to add on that?
Yeah, hi everyone. Yeah, I mean, you know, one of the things we've done quite a lot of work on is trying to ensure that the courses that we're delivering are relevant. And so the sort of information you were giving about user-centric design, you know, I think it would be interesting to have a discussion around that in terms of what we're delivering on our computing programs, because those are perhaps things that we don't always consider as much as we should do. So fitting in to make sure that we're upskilling graduates in the right areas, I think, is really important. The other thing, there's a couple of other things that we do at the university which are around knowledge exchange, and I wondered whether they might be worth sort of looking at in a bit more detail, because it might be potential to sort of do some sort of input from academic staff into other organisations to sort of share experiences and good practice and those sorts of things. So we're open to discussions really, and we've already had some discussions with you anyway, but you know, I think there's opportunities there.
Definitely, thank you. You're absolutely right. Just look at Sam, I can see you put a question in. Would you like to do a quick intro to yourself? And you're talking here about this new concept of service design for people in the public sector and how we're clear to people what it actually means and what the benefits are. And I see you've also touched on Welsh language, which almost feels like we've said that on purpose, because that's hopefully going to be the next of these knowledge series will all be about Welsh language and service design in Wales. But Sam, do you want to say hello?
Yeah, hello. Hi, everyone. I said in the chat, I'm quite new in the role. So I'm one of the 3 CDOs that have been brought in to public sector across Wales. There's only 2 of us at the moment, but there will be a 3rd anytime now. So for me, the whole issue around service design is when you talk to people, they don't really understand it as a concept yet. It's, in fact, a lot of people don't understand digital as a thing either. So we are really, I'm not saying it's kind of back in the dark ages, it isn't that at all. It's the fact that we've actually missed out a little bit of critical information. And that's all of our fault, because we are all digital practitioners, and we probably haven't been as clear and as upfront because we know it. We don't always explain it in the way that everyone else knows it. So we just talk because we talk the talk all the time. So for me, service design is, it's to come up with some kind of clear examples of what that really means. And there was one earlier around the whole cervical screening thing, but actually let's, we could do with a range of those, and something that is kind of clear and concise for service design in Wales as a flavour of Welshness to it. We've all had that wonderful experience of filling in a great form on a council website or another public sector website. And it's a really good form, and we love it because the front end development was fab, and then it disappears into a black hole and doesn't come back for 3 weeks because the processes and the back office systems and the people working on them, it's just all not there, because the service design's got some big holes in it, and you're only as good as the weakest or the deepest of those holes. And so trying to come up with something that is really attainable for everyone in the public sector to look at and go, oh, I get it now, I think is really, really key. And they've got to be really simple, really consumable, because you're talking to quite often very senior people in organizations, and that always has to be the most simplest as possible. And also one that will, if you get it wrong, this is what it means to you. Because most of us that have been in senior public sector roles will know that you give everything the Daily Mail sniff test. And if it looks like it's a Daily Mail story, if it goes wrong, you put a little bit more effort in to getting it right. So there's something around how we position it and how we talk to people about it. I put the Welsh language message in there because, geez, that's hard. It's not just do it in English and then translate it. And anyone that thinks it is massively wrong. And designing a service in Welsh is really quite challenging, and you can have things which will be very different if they're in English and in Welsh. And that's an added cost, added resource, added maintenance, and there's a whole other level of challenge, let alone finding people who can do the really important language bit for us, because those skills are probably as scarce as service design people. So yeah, extra whammy on that one.
Lovely, thank you. I wonder if I could ask Ian to come back a moment here on 2 of those things, really, because I know that the work that's been going on with the squad in the 3 councils has, they've been doing some testing of prototypes, usability testing in Welsh language, so I'd be quite interested on how that's come about and how it's worked. And the other thing I was thinking, Ian, in the space of what Sam was just saying there, it's been a tough old year for public services in Wales, well, everywhere, but in Wales is what we're experiencing. Local authorities have been at the heart of that. It's been a challenging time. And I was wondering how this concept of doing this squad work and user-centered service design with everything else going on, how that sort of ladder, like using the word landed, but how that worked for the councils, given a lot of what Sam has just said about how we explain this through to senior leaders and others.
It's a great question. The second question has been a challenge, if I'm being honest, because of some of the reasons that Sam just mentioned. But I think there was a little bit of pushback at the start because people just want an online form or they want a website or something. I think as they've gone through the process and they can see the benefits, and in simple terms, so to come back what Sam was saying, what we're trying to do is make our services simpler for residents to do the thing they set out to do, and make sure there are no dead ends that result in calls coming back. So when people are co-designing with us, and not just they give us a brief in terms of if it's a digital service and then they go off and get it six months later, because they are co-designing with us, they can really see the benefits of the service design approach and what it can offer their service as well. And it's not just seen as a digital thing. And in terms of the user testing with the Welsh language, we've been doing as part of the squad work and across the 3 councils and with the Centre and Social Finance. I mentioned in my slides, the user research part is the key element of a user-centered design approach. And having that squad come in has been really beneficial, because it's brought that expertise in that doesn't really exist in most councils in Wales. There are no dedicated professional user researchers. So by really tapping into that resource and testing the Welsh language prototypes with people who've been identified as service users, who've used the service, their preference is speaking Welsh as a first language, it's brought lots of insight back in terms of that continual iteration of what is the right service that we should be making. So we started off with simple paper prototypes. We went to a walkthrough kind of non-coded prototype, and we've been involving our users from the very start all the way through in terms of English and Welsh. And as Sam touched upon, Welsh users might have totally different user needs or different pathways to somebody conversing in English. So it's really helping cover some of this.
I did the talking whilst I was on mute bit, sorry. Very, very conscious of time. We've only got a minute, so, and I did want to just sum up a couple of things I'm just going to mention from the comments in here. Sam also talked about getting people at senior levels in the organisation to understand. I know Joe Carter's on the line, and Service Works has been working with the centre to do some of that training. I would have asked Joe to give us a bit of an overview if we had time, but there's going to be a blog post coming out from the centre talking about that very soon. There's a question from Helith in here that about continuous improvement practitioners and whether there's any examples of where continuous improvement staff have moved over into digital and service design. So Darius and Jess, if you could hold that thought, because I'll come back to you briefly in a moment. And one of the last thing I wanted to mention was, so I'm just looking up who said it further on here. Oh, Tony Curlis, thank you, Tony, about ongoing comms channels for CDPS for knowledge sharing. I'll answer that one quickly, Tony, not yet, but there will be, and that's one of the things we're working on and the best way to do that and what platforms work. So if anyone here's got ideas on that, that would be great. We are at 2 o'clock, but if I could just ask Darius and Jess to give a last thought on that question about continuous improvement and anything they'd like to say to finish.
After you, Darius, you can...
Sorry, I keep doing this to you both, don't I? Go on, Darius.
As well.
Yeah, I mean, service design is a multidisciplinary sport, you know, so being involved in service design doesn't mean you have to be a service designer. I would say that a sort of a CI background, it probably is quite an interesting way into it, because fundamentally the idea of iterating things and making it better is going to be your religion, isn't it? So, you know, that's, I think probably culturally that would be a really good fit. And then it's probably just about thinking about what specific skills you either want to bring to a multidisciplinary team or you want to develop. What do you think, Jess?
Yep, I agree. That's what I was going to say, that you don't need to be a designer to do service design. And like Darius said earlier, there gets to a point where there are quite technical skills that you do need training in, like especially things like user research. I think that is like a skilled thing that someone shouldn't necessarily do without the proper training, but also there's loads of transferable and applicable skills. And some of the best people I've worked with who do service design, like wouldn't consider themselves a service designer, or like haven't necessarily come from that background, but just work in that way because they just get it. So I think there's, yeah, a blend there.
Thank you very much. Right, it's 2:02, which means we have run over. A huge thank you to Darius, Jess, Ian and Tim, and to everyone who's joined us. We want to keep this conversation going. We are going to find ways to do it. In the meantime, you can contact us at info@digitalpublicservices.gov.wales. I always get the wrong way, .wales.gov, apologies, or via Twitter, and we will do more of these sessions and keep talking. Thank you all for your input.